In the late summer of 2003, after 18 months of steady, quiet ridicule, Silas Blackwood stood on his back porch and watched water, clear and cold, trickle from a place on the hillside no one under the age of 80 in Garrison County remembered existed. The water came not from a well driller's rig, not from a government conservation grant, but from the patient, methodical work of 70 Katahdin hair sheep. And that trickle of water, which would eventually fill the stock tanks of 3 separate farms during the worst drought in a generation, began with a bill for $18,450 that Silas Blackwood, then 78 years old, had refused to pay. Let me tell you about the hill because you have to understand the hill to understand the choice. It wasn't a mountain, not even by the modest standards of southern Ohio. It was a 17-acre slope on the northern edge of the Blackwood farm, a piece of land the family had owned since 1888. For most of that time, it was known simply as the North Slope. It faced away from the sun, held the frost longer in the spring, and was covered in a thin, clay-loam soil over a bed of fractured shale. The grade averaged 22 degrees, steep enough that Silas's grandfather, a man not given to exaggeration, had written in a leather-bound ledger in 1931 that it was land fit only for holding the world together. He'd grazed a small flock of merino sheep on it then, but when the wool market collapsed for the third time, he'd pulled them off and let it go. By 2002, the North Slope was a problem. It had become a dense, tangled, and altogether hostile wilderness of invasive species. Multiflora rose, introduced by the State Conservation Department in the 1950s as a living fence, had become a green monster, its thorny canes reaching 15 feet in the air and forming impenetrable thickets. Autumn olive, another well-intentioned mistake, grew in dense stands, its silvery leaves shading out everything beneath it. And running through it all was a web of Japanese honeysuckle that choked the life out of the few remaining native hardwoods. The slope was a fire hazard in the dry months, a breeding ground for ticks and coyotes, and its shadow was creeping ever farther across the lower pasture, stealing 2 hours of valuable sunlight each day. For 10 years, Silas had watched it worsen. He was 78, had been farming this land for 62 of those years, and was known for a particular kind of observational patience that his neighbors sometimes mistook for inaction. He would stand at the edge of the lower pasture for an hour after chores, his hands resting on a fence post his own father had set, and just watch the slope. He watched the way the wind moved through the autumn olive, the way the snow clung to the multiflora rose, the way the deep shade seemed to physically press down on the grass below. His grandson, Ben, saw something different. Ben was 22, fresh out of Ohio State with a 2-year degree in agricultural business. He saw 17 acres of unproductive land, a liability on the farm's balance sheet. He saw a problem that had a modern, efficient, and mechanical solution. Which is why, on a bright Tuesday morning in April of 2002, a gleaming new pickup truck, the logo for AG Pro Solutions emblazoned on the door, pulled down Silas's gravel lane. The man who stepped out was Dale Jepson. He was 38 years old, had been the top regional salesman for AG Pro for 6 years running, and was known for his firm handshake and his unshakable confidence in the data printed on his glossy brochures. He wore a clean, collared shirt and steel-toed work boots that had never seen a day of mud. He represented institutional knowledge, the data-driven certainty of the modern agricultural industry. He was not a bad man. He was just a man who believed, with every fiber of his being, that every problem had a corresponding piece of equipment that could solve it. He and Ben had already spoken. Ben had called him, frustrated after another conversation with his grandfather that ended with Silas just shaking his head and saying, "The time's not right." Dale set his briefcase on the hood of his truck and pulled out a folder. "Silas," he began, his voice projecting the easy confidence of a man who closes deals every day. "Ben here tells me you've got a bit of a brush problem on your north-facing acreage." Silas, who had been sitting on the porch steps, nodded slowly. He did not stand. He just looked at Dale, his gaze neutral. "Some folks might call it that." "Well," Dale said, flipping open the folder to a picture of a massive, red machine that looked like an instrument of war. "I'm here to tell you that we have the definitive solution. This is the Titan 1500 series rotary cutter. We call it a brush hog, but that's like calling a battleship a canoe. Let me tell you about the Titan 1500. It was an impressive piece of engineering. It weighed 3,200 pounds, had a cutting width of 15 feet, and was constructed from quarter-inch reinforced steel. Its 3 gearboxes could handle up to 250 horsepower, though it only required 90 horsepower at the PTO. It could chew through trees up to 5 inches in diameter and turn a 17-acre thicket of multiflora rose into mulch in less than a week. It was the embodiment of overwhelming force. Dale laid out the numbers. The cost of the machine was $18,450. He had calculated the fuel cost for Silas's 110 horsepower John Deere tractor to run it for the estimated 40 hours it would take to clear the slope. He had factored in the increased yield from the lower pasture once it was getting full sun again. He presented a spreadsheet that showed, in stark black and white, that the machine would pay for itself in 24 months. A return on investment of 50% per year. "This isn't an expense, Silas," Dale said, tapping the bottom line on the spreadsheet with his pen. "It's an investment in productivity. You're turning a liability into an asset. It's clean, it's fast, and it's final."
Ben stood beside Dole, nodding.
This was the language he understood.
Roi, assets, productivity.
It was the language of his college classrooms. It was logical. It was modern. It was smart. Silas looked at the picture of the big red machine. He looked at the spreadsheet with its confident numbers. Then he looked past them, up at the slope itself, green and impenetrable in the morning light. He was quiet for a full minute. Dale, accustomed to closing, waited for the inevitable questions about financing options. Instead, Silas spoke to the hill. "That thing's heavy," he said, not looking at Dale. 3,200 pounds. Plus the tractor. All that weight on a 22-degree grade after a spring rain. It'll compact that clay down to pavement. The first big storm. All that fresh mulch and half my topsoil will end up in the creek. Dale smiled, a patient, practiced smile. "We recommend waiting for a dry spell, of course. And we can sell you a broadcast spreader attachment. You can put down some winter rye to hold the soil. Another attachment. Another solution." Silas nodded again, slowly. "And what does it do to the stumps?" "Pulverizes them," Dale said with pride. "Anything up to 5 inches, it just turns to splinters. Nothing will grow back from that." "No," Silas agreed. "It won't. But the multiflora rose, its roots run deep. The seeds are in the soil, dozens of them for every square foot. You scalp the top, you give those seeds all the sunlight they could ever want. Next year, I won't have a thicket of 15-foot canes. I'll have a carpet of 3-foot thorns, 10 times thicker than before. I'll be spraying herbicide from May till September just to keep it beat back." Ben shifted his weight, embarrassed. This was what he hated. This old-timer contrarianism, this refusal to accept progress. "Granddad," he said, his voice tight. "Mr. Jepson knows what he's talking about. This is what these machines are for." Silas finally turned his eyes from the hill and looked at Dale. "Your machine is a hammer, son. A very good one. But not every problem is a nail." He stood up, his joints creaking. He was a tall, spare man, his posture still straight from a lifetime of physical work. He walked past Dale and Ben and into the barn. He came back a moment later holding a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with time. It was his grandfather's farm ledger, dating back to 1910. He opened it to a page dated August 1932. The handwriting was a neat, precise cursive. "My granddad wrote here," Silas said, his voice quiet. "The north slope is poor, but the sheep make it rich. Their hooves break the crust. Their mouths find the weed. Their droppings feed the grass. They do not take. They make." He closed the book. He said the sheep knew something the plow didn't. They knew the difference between clearing and healing. Dale looked confused, his sales pitch utterly derailed. "Silas, with all due respect, we're not talking about 1932. Technology has advanced." "It has," Silas said. "But the hill hasn't. It's the same clay, the same shale, same grade." He looked at Ben. "I'm not buying the machine." Ben's face fell. He felt a hot flush of anger and shame. Then what are you going to do? Just let it rot. No, Silas said. I'm going to buy some sheep. The decision was made. 2 weeks later, Silas took $17,500 from his savings account, money he had earmarked for a new roof on the barn, and drove his old stock trailer 3 hours west to a breeder who specialized in Katahdin hair sheep. Let me tell you about Katahdins. They are not the picturesque, fluffy sheep of storybooks. They are a practical, hardy breed, developed in Maine for their tolerance of heat and cold, their resistance to parasites, and, most importantly, their foraging ability. They shed their winter coats so they don't need shearing. They are browsers as much as grazers, meaning they will readily eat weeds, brush, and even the leaves of thorny plants like multiflora rose. They are, in essence, biological brush hogs. Silas bought 70 ewes, most of them already bred. They cost him, on average, $250 a head. The total came to $17,500. He spent another $950 on portable electric netting and a solar-powered fence charger. His total investment was $18,450, the exact price of the Titan 1500 rotary cutter. When the news got out, the laughing started. It began at the feed store, where one of the regulars saw Silas loading up on mineral supplements. "Heard you bought a new brush hog, Silas," he'd said with a grin. A fuzzy one. The joke spread to the co-op, to the diner, to the weekly livestock auction. Silas Blackwood had chosen 70 sheep over a brand-new, top-of-the-line machine. In the pragmatic, equipment-focused world of modern farming, this was not just eccentric. It was foolish. They gave the North Slope a new name, Shepherd's Folly. Ben heard it everywhere he went. He started making excuses to not go into town. He felt the ridicule as a personal failure. The first few months did nothing to prove the skeptics wrong. Silas and Ben spent a week stringing the electric netting across the lowest, most accessible section of the slope, a 2-acre paddock. When they released the sheep, the animals didn't immediately attack the massive walls of multiflora rose. They nibbled at the patches of clover and fescue at the base. They explored the perimeter. They looked small and utterly inadequate against the scale of the problem. "This is a joke," Ben said to his grandfather one evening, watching the sheep from the pasture below. "They're not doing anything. They're learning the land," Silas replied calmly. "Give them time." Time was the currency Silas understood and the modern world had forgotten. Dale Jepson's proposal was about speed. 40 hours of machine time. Silas's plan was measured in seasons. The community wanted a result. Silas was tending a process. Let me tell you about that process because the genius was in the details. Silas was practicing a form of intensive rotational grazing. Every 3 to 4 days, he and Ben would move the flock and the temporary fence to a fresh 2-acre patch of brush. The sheep, concentrated in a small area, had no choice but to eat what was in front of them, and their preferences were revelatory. First, they went after the honeysuckle, stripping the vines from the trees as high as they could reach. Then they attacked the poison ivy, a plant they consumed with no ill effects. They ate the broadleaf weeds. Only then, when the more palatable options were gone, did they turn their attention to the main enemy, the multiflora rose. They couldn't eat the thick, woody canes, but they nibbled away the tender new shoots and stripped every single leaf and flower they could reach, up to a height of about 4 feet. They were not destroying the plant. They were weakening it, stealing its ability to photosynthesize and store energy. Meanwhile, their other work was beginning. Their 280 small, sharp hooves were chipping away at the hard-packed clay, aerating the soil with every step. They weren't heavy enough to cause the deep compaction of a tractor tire. Their impact was light, repetitive, and constructive. And everywhere they went, they left their manure. Small, nitrogen-rich pellets that didn't smother the ground like a cow pie but crumbled easily and were readily absorbed by the soil. They were not just clearing, they were cultivating. It was slow, agonizingly slow. By the end of the first summer, they had worked their way across about half of the 17 acres. From a distance, the slope didn't look cleared. It looked ragged, chewed up. The big canes of the roses were still standing, bare and skeletal. It looked like a failure. Dale Jepson drove by one day in September. He slowed his truck, looked up at the mangled hillside, and shook his head with a small, pitying smile. He didn't stop. He didn't have to. The evidence seemed to speak for itself. The machine would have been done in a week. The sheep, after 5 months, had only made a mess. That winter, the second phase of Silas's plan began. The sheep, now shaggy with their winter coats, continued to browse, but their main impact came from their weight. They used the dense thickets of leafless rose canes as shelter from the wind and snow, trampling the brittle, dead stalks underfoot. What they didn't eat, they broke. In the spring of 2003, the lambs were born. The flock swelled to over 120 animals. And when the green-up began, the true battle commenced. The weakened multiflora rose tried to send up new shoots from its roots. The sheep, hungry for the first green growth of the season, devoured them as soon as they appeared. The seeds that had been waiting in the soil, now exposed to sunlight, sprouted into a green haze of tiny, thorny seedlings. The sheep ate those too. They were a living, breathing, 24-hour-a-day maintenance crew. A machine clears once. The sheep were clearing it constantly. It was around this time, nearly a year into the project, that Ben began to see it. He was out moving the fence line on a warm May morning. He looked back at the section they had started on the previous spring. It wasn't bare dirt, as it would have been behind the Titan 1500. It was covered in a thick, green carpet of grass. Native grasses he hadn't seen on the farm in years. Big bluestem switchgrass were poking up through the sod. The soil under his feet felt different. It was no longer a hard, slick sheet of clay. It was spongy. He could press his heel into it and feel it give. He knelt down and dug his fingers into the earth. It was teeming with earthworms. He looked up at the current paddock. The sheep were working their way through a dense stand of autumn olive, their mouths moving constantly. They were relentless, patient, and thorough. And for the first time, Ben didn't see a flock of sheep. He saw a system, a complex, biological system that was not only removing a problem but actively building a healthier, more resilient landscape in its place. He felt a different kind of shame then, not the shame of being laughed at, but the shame of his own blindness. He walked back to the house and found his grandfather on the porch, watching. "The grass is coming back," Ben said. It was not a question. Silas nodded. "Always was there. Just waiting for some light and a chance." "I was wrong, Granddad," Ben said, his voice quiet. "I was wrong about the machine." Silas looked at his grandson, and for the first time in a year, a small smile touched his lips. "The machine ain't wrong. It's just got a different answer. I was interested in a different question." The summer of 2003 was dry. By July, the pastures were turning brown. The creek that ran through the lower end of the Blackwood farm had slowed to a trickle. Farmers in the county were starting to haul water for their livestock, a costly and labor-intensive chore. The old-timers were saying it was the worst drought since 1988. On the north slope, however, something remarkable was happening. Because the ground was no longer a hard, non-porous shell, the little rain that did fall was absorbed instead of running off. The growing layer of organic matter from the trampled brush and the sheep's manure acted like a sponge, holding the moisture in the soil. The new growth of grass stayed greener longer than any other pasture on the farm. By August, the sheep had completed their first full pass of the 17 acres and were starting again at the bottom. The transformation was staggering. The impenetrable thickets were gone. The tall, skeletal canes of the multiflora rose that remained were brittle and brown. Silas could walk through areas that had been impassable for 30 years. The sunlight, for the first time in half a century, was reaching the forest floor across the entire slope. It was on a blistering hot afternoon, August 14th, that the decisive moment arrived. A brief, intense thunderstorm had rolled through the night before, dropping a half-inch of rain in 20 minutes. Not enough to break the drought, but enough to settle the dust. Ben was checking the flock when he noticed something near the base of the slope, in a section the sheep had grazed down to the nub just the week before. It was a patch of dark, damp soil in a small hollow surrounded by slabs of shale. This was unusual. In the current heat, the ground should have been bone dry within an hour of the rain. He called for his grandfather. Silas walked over, his stride unhurried. He knelt down beside the damp patch, his old knees protesting. The sheep had cleared the area so completely that the underlying rock formations were visible. He looked at the place for a long time, his eyes tracing the lines in the shale. Then he looked at the few remaining oak trees nearby, noting their age and position. He reached out with his bare, calloused hand and began to scrape away the mud. He dug for only a minute, pulling away the soft earth and small stones. He cleared a small basin in the rock, about the size of a dinner plate. He and Ben waited, watching in the breathless, humid air. He watched a single, clear drop of water well up from a fissure in the stone. Then another. It wasn't a gush. It was a slow, quiet, miraculous seep. A gathering of moisture, coalescing from some hidden place deep within the hill. Silas sat back on his heels. He didn't smile. He didn't show any outward sign of triumph. He simply watched the water, his expression one of deep, quiet reverence. "What is that?" Ben whispered, his voice full of awe. Silas pointed to a notation in his grandfather's ledger, which he had brought with him from the house. The entry for May 1934 read, "Drought holds. The stock is thin, but the seep on the north slope still runs clear. The sheep keep the ground open so it can breathe. Thank God for the sheep and the hill's gift." "That," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the reason." They spent the next day digging. They followed the seep back, clearing a small basin and lining it with flat field stones they gathered from the fence line, building a small spring box just as the ledger described. The trickle of water was slow but astonishingly steady. They measured it using a 5-gallon bucket and a stopwatch. It filled the bucket in 2.5 minutes. 2 gallons per minute. 120 gallons an hour. 2,880 gallons a day. It was more than enough for their own herd of cattle, which had been drinking from a pond that was shrinking daily. Within a week, the word was out. It traveled not as a joke this time, but as a hushed rumor. Silas Blackwood had found water. His closest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Tom Haskins, whose well was beginning to pump air, was the first to arrive. He came not in his tractor but in his pickup, and he didn't drive up to the house. He parked at the end of the lane and walked, his hat in his hand, a gesture of respect. "Silas," he said, avoiding his eyes, I heard you found some water." "The sheep found it," Silas said, turning a valve on a new pipe he'd run to a holding tank. "I just watched." He filled Haskins's 300-gallon water trailer for him. He didn't ask for money. The next day, another neighbor came, and another. For the next 6 weeks, until the autumn rains finally broke the drought, a steady, quiet procession of trucks and water trailers came down Silas Blackwood's lane. He filled them all. The north slope, the hill they had called Shepherd's Folly, was saving the livestock of 3 different farms. Dale Jepson drove by again in late September. This time he stopped. He got out of his gleaming truck and stood by the fence, looking. He saw the transformed hillside, now covered in green grass where a jungle of thorns had been. He saw the flock of healthy sheep grazing peacefully. He saw the line of pipe running from the base of the slope to a large black holding tank. He saw Tom Haskins filling his trailer, his head bowed in gratitude. Dale stood there for 10 minutes. He didn't say a word to anyone. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. That spring, Silas sold 50 lambs at market. They were grass-fed, healthy animals, and they brought a premium price. The sale grossed him $9,500. The wool, which the Katahdins shed naturally, was collected by Ben and sold to local spinners and weavers for another $500. The flock was no longer just a tool. It was a productive, profitable enterprise. The North Slope was no longer a liability. It had become the farm's most resilient and valuable pasture. Ben took over the farm a few years later when Silas's health began to fail. He kept the flock of Katahdins, rotating them through the farm's pastures, using them as his primary tool for land management. The spring on the North Slope never failed. It continued to run clear and cold, a permanent feature of the farm's hydrology, a testament to a choice made years before. The story became a quiet legend in Garrison County. The laughter had long since died, replaced by a kind of grudging respect. Farmers who were once proud of their massive machines and their chemical inputs would sometimes pull Ben aside at the co-op and ask him, in low voices, about rotational grazing, about the Katahdins, about how he managed his grass. What the sheep had done was more profound than simply clearing land. A machine imposes a solution. It arrives, inflicts its will upon the landscape, and leaves. The Titan 1500 would have solved the brush problem in 40 hours, but it would have created new, more subtle problems in its wake. Soil compaction, erosion, a chemical-dependent monoculture of grasses, and the permanent concealment of the spring. Its work would have been an ending. The sheep were a beginning. They initiated a process of restoration. They worked with the land, not against it. They stimulated the growth of desirable species while suppressing the undesirable ones. They rebuilt the soil, increased its water-holding capacity, and reawakened a dormant part of the ecosystem. They revealed a hidden strength in the land that a machine never could have found. A machine solves a problem you can see. A living system solves problems you've forgotten exist. One imposes a single, violent answer on the land. The other asks the land for its own slow, patient, and collaborative solution. Silas Blackwood didn't buy 70 sheep to find water. He bought them to restore a relationship between his family and that 17 acres of forgotten ground. The water was not the goal. It was the sign of the relationship restored. It was the hill's gift, finally remembered.